All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever suits you best, and welcome to this lecture by Sarah Earnshaw. I would also like to thank at the very beginning Marga, Schweiger-Wilhelm, and Miriam Held for organizing this event, and thanks to all of you out there for joining us tonight and for enduring yet another Zoom or YouTube event. We know how hard this is, and this might continue for a while, but that's the way it is. And the good thing is that we can, connect people across continents, across different time zones, and all of that. In the unlikely case that you don't know what the Bavarian American Academy is, Marga Schweiger-Wilhelm has asked me to read out just one paragraph about the BAA and its mission and its activities. And I will read the sentence out to you, and then we'll continue with the introduction of Sarah and the lecture today. The BAA is a platform and network for research and exchange among scholars dedicated to the study of American society and culture. Approximately 200 members specialize in fields as wide-ranging as history, geography, literature, media, and the arts, religion, and politics, and often these fields are intertwined. Our program includes annual conferences, a yearly international summer school, film screenings, and many other events for the academic community, as well as for a wider public. We also support young scholars with a fellowship program, travel grants, and we award one outstanding scholar with the BAA Dissertation Prize. Please check out our website for more information. So, my name is Uwe Ludwig. I'm teaching American history here at LMU Munich, and I'm glad to host and moderate this lecture, which is, as you know, part of the International Weeks Against Racism program, a topic that is of utmost importance, especially in the American context, but certainly not limited to that context. Only last year, we saw the Black Lives Matter movement turn into a truly global movement after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And Sarah Earnshaw in her talk today will take this discourse to a different level, I think. That is to the level of international relations, critical security studies, and United States foreign policy, things we might not immediately think of when we think of racism and human rights. I will now briefly introduce Sarah Earnshaw in order to maximize the time for her talk and for the Q&A afterwards. As I said, I will do this briefly. If you have questions, you can either type them into the YouTube chat, but you have to be signed in order to do this. If you do not want to do this, you can also send an email to held@amerikahaus.de, and I think you will see this email address in the YouTube chat either right now or in a few seconds or minutes. So, our speaker today, Sarah Earnshaw, has received a joint honors MA in History and English Literature from the University of Glasgow. She also received an MLitt degree, Master of Letters, in War Studies from the University of Glasgow. After that, she moved to Munich to join the doctoral program here at the America-Institut, where I had the honor to be her supervisor. And I guess this is what brings me here today. It's great to see you again, of course. For her thesis, of which we will hear more in a few minutes, she has not just been awarded a summa cum laude as a degree, but also the dissertation prize of the Bavarian American Academy. Unfortunately, we couldn't really celebrate this prize, and I guess this is kind of an ersatz event for the more festive things that we usually do. In October 2019, she accepted a postdoctoral fellowship in the history of forced migration, awarded by the German Historical Institute's Pacific Regional Office in Berkeley, which also made her simultaneously a visiting scholar at the Institute of European Studies, UC Berkeley. In May, however, Sarah Earnshaw will come back to Europe. I think it's official now. Sarah, stop me if this is your last chance to stop me. Otherwise, I will announce it. Okay, so no intervention. She will be coming back to Europe because Bavaria has been calling in a way, and Sarah Earnshaw has accepted the call. She will join Kerstin Schmidt and others at the Catholic University of Eichstätt to work as a postdoc scholar on the DFG Graduiertenkolleg practicing place. So congratulations again belatedly for the BAA award and of course for this new position. We are very much looking forward to listening to your talk today. Thanks for joining us, Sarah.
Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction, Eva, and yeah, indeed lovely to see you. If a little strange in these times, especially not being able to see any of the audience. But yes, I want to also extend, my best wishes. Good evening to you in Munich. Good morning from San Francisco, where I am currently, and greetings to you from where and whenever you're joining. Of course, I want to give a quick thanks to the Bavarian American Academy for thinking of and inviting me to speak as part of the Munich program of the Internationale Woche gegen Rassismus. It's really a privilege to participate. And I want to start by making a sort of necessary acknowledgement of my privilege as a British and white international scholar in the US. And this also functions as a sort of entry point for this discussion of race and right, humanity and coloniality in US security. So I acknowledge my current site in San Francisco on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, and UC Berkeley on that of the Haijun, the Chochenyu speaking Ohlone. The shifting borders and countercultural claims that have been staked in the history of the San Francisco Bay Area, from the gold rush, the Grateful Dead and Google, these have all taken place within an ongoing settler coloniality. And this refuses indigenous self-determination and the establishment of the land of the free. But against this erasure, Native American communities continue to live and thrive in the Bay Area to build projects of emancipation and collaboration, and such as the native occupation of Alcatraz Island from 1969 to 71. But they're also, the Friendship House in San Francisco, first opened in 1961, and continuing to provide support and a place of community. So from this, who is included in the story of America as the land of the free? And how is this freedom entwined with a sort of global human rights? Jimmy Carter is perhaps the president most associated with human rights, and especially with the human rights foreign policy. And in his farewell address in 1981, he not only placed the US at the forefront of the struggle for universal rights, but rhetorically placed the nation as the embodiment of a universal freedom. So to the tune of American exceptionalism, Carter declared, and I quote, "America did not invent human rights. Human rights invented America. The love of liberty is the common blood that flows in our American veins," end quote. So, I mean, it doesn't take much genealogical digging to become clear who is excluded from this bloodline. And as I'll touch upon in a moment, and as Uwe mentioned in the introduction, these exclusions were viscerally underscored in 2020 with the anti-racism protests that swept the globe. The history and the ongoing oppressions of coloniality, as well as the transatlantic slave trade, cannot simply be discounted as an aberration in the pathway to a universal liberal international order, but rather such exclusions have been fundamental in the constitution of Western modernity and the universal category of the modern human. So as part of the BIA program in the International Weeks for Racism, I want to take this opportunity in this discussion sort of to raise questions on assumed knowledges and how the international is sort of thought in the sort of Western centric notions of IR, of security, and to sort of unsettle these taken for granted goods. So I aim to highlight a need for a deeper interrogation of concepts that are lauded as solutions to systemic racism, both in US domestic and foreign policy, and to face head on the sort of underpinning logics of coloniality and the racial hierarchies of autonomy. So it's the apparent ease with which human rights can be picked up by US statesmen that led me to study them as a facet of US international security. It was when I was writing my thesis for a master's degree in war studies that I sort of was confronted by this frequent invocation of human rights. I was researching the political philosophies underpinning post-Cold War US interventionism. And yeah, I kept encountering human rights, a phrase oft uttered, but rarely explained, and sort of, yeah, just a taken for granted value. And I got to wondering from there, what do human rights mean as a tenet of US foreign policy? As I encountered them in the sort of neo-Kantian democratic peace theory, in liberal international order, in neoconservatism, as well as in the tenets of preemptive war. So across the next wee while, I don't know, about 30 minutes or so, I will introduce my notion of the human rights regime of truth before turning to these recent questions, or the police brutality that we've recently been once again faced with and discussing. And then I'll dive into the monopolizing of the human and the reterritorialization of US human rights foreign policy. So a red thread of sorts for this talk is the definition and defense of the boundaries of freedom. I want to explore how a specific notion of human rights, so that is the negative civil and political rights of the individual, have emerged as seemingly neutral standards of sovereignty within a constellation of US international security. So how this assumed neutrality can maintain and reproduce violence, inequality, and racist exclusions. So my dissertation that I'm currently wrangling into a book, I propose the Foucauldian notion of the regime of truth to human rights in US foreign relations. So that's the means through which to distinguish between true and false, who can speak with authority in, right speak, who or what behavior is rendered a problem of human rights, and what are the appropriate measures in correcting. So as a general point from my book, the inability or unwillingness to provide fundamental freedoms is a central feature in the US presentation of post-colonial spaces as failed and rogue states, as nodes of disorder and instability that are then subject to increasingly preemptive pacification. The titular quote of this talk, and indeed my dissertation, was uttered by President George W. Bush in his opening sentences of the first public address following the 9/11 attacks. Quote, "Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended," end quote. So this assertion relies upon a particular notion of what freedom means, who is threatening, and what is legitimate in the defense of this freedom. Just 3 months later, days before coalition forces in Afghanistan would oust the Taliban from power, human rights were placed center stage in the fight against terror. The proclamation that named the 10th of December 2001 as Human Rights Day repeatedly referred to a coalition of civilized peoples in a fight against, quote, enemies of freedom who do not respect or value individual human rights. So these are the sort of fault lines of civilization and liberty within this threatscape of terror. And they sort of naturalize spaces of freedom and of unfreedom. In the opening salvo of the 2002 National Security Strategy, which outlined the Bush Doctrine of preemptive war, this proposed a constellation of sovereign state standards of human rights, democratic governance, and neoliberal economic structures as assuring a pathway to peace, security, and individual freedom. So to propose this regime of truth, I do want to say that it's not to claim that human rights abuses do not occur, nor that international human rights law hasn't protected lives and done a huge amount of good. But rather, as Foucault claimed, practicing criticism is a matter of making facile gestures difficult. So just as the president's invocation of America as the land of freedom and the embodiment of human rights is facile, so too is the tendency to reduce US human rights speak as merely hypocrisy or as a palatable mask for more nefarious interests. And I argue this fails to grapple with the discursive power of freedom as rights. This historical formation, wherein a particular formulation of rights is tied not only to the individual, but to international peace and security. I'm getting a spam call, apologies. During the Iraq War, for instance, human rights were invoked, not only when the failure to find weapons of mass destruction, but rather as the protection of women and children, as the toppling of this tyrannical leader, but also in the embrace of counterinsurgency as a means of pacification in 2006. And the Army Manual was even lauded by the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy in Harvard, Sarah Sewell, who wrote an introduction to this radical field manual where human rights was placed front and foremost in this pacification process. So in his preface to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, Sartre dismissed the protestations of high-minded people, liberals or just soft-hearted, who were shocked by the supposed inconsistency of the European extolling the values of liberty, fraternity, and equality, alongside the racist exploitations of colonialism. And I quote, "There's nothing more consistent than a racist humanism, since the European has only been able to become a man through creating slaves and monsters," end quote. So the Internationale Wochen gegen Rassismus are an extension of the UN's annual International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is on the 21st of March, so just yesterday. This day is observed to mark a particularly egregious instance of police brutality in apartheid South Africa in 1960, and it commemorates the 69 people killed at the Sharpsville massacre as the police opened fire on demonstrators who were protesting discriminatory pass laws. In a segue, I hope is not too trite, in May of 2020, police brutality once again underscored the racist fault lines in the right to life, liberty, and security of person, with the US as a flashpoint for worldwide protest. Once again, images of Black Death were proliferated and projected across the country and indeed the globe. The protracted 9-minute murder of George Floyd shone a light on the epidemic of white supremacist violence and police brutality, as the names Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain, Rayshard Brooks were chanted in the streets. And bearing in mind, these are the names we know of the people killed just in the months immediately before and after George Floyd's violent death. So the appeal, the outcry that Black Lives Matter is a call to recognize and respect the humanity of Black people, not only against police violence, but the wider inhumanity of racial injustice, where Black people are so often placed at the bottom of an implicit racial hierarchy. And we can't ignore the elephant in the Zoom. The coronavirus pandemic has obviously provided something as a backdrop to these conversations of justice and indeed policing, as it's exacerbated uneven racial, gendered, and class relations of power across the world. It's not only domestic, where in the US, the African American communities are among the worst affected, but on a global scale, this is clear in differing access to the vaccine. Just this weekend, the BBC reported on leaked documents that countries, including my own UK, where I currently reside, in the US, and the EU, where I'm broadcasting to, are blocking WHO proposals for so-called developing nations for help not only from procuring, but also from developing vaccines on a larger scale. So racial disparities in access to healthcare and other aspects of social security surely raise the question, what is a human right? Or what are included in human rights? And these are not new issues to the US. President Roosevelt pursued a second Bill of Rights in the 1940s. These economic rights would include the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy healthcare, alongside rights to employment, adequate food, and housing. Quote, all of these rights spell security. So this episode speaks to the contestations and indeed the historical contingency of human rights claims. But it was Eleanor Roosevelt who would play an instrumental role in the drafting process of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the UN. 74 years ago, in 1947, during the drafting process, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, the NAACP, made an appeal for the rights of African Americans and filed a petition to the newly created United Nations. And I'll make use of the very explanatory title. It's not quite as catchy as Black Lives Matter. An appeal to the world, a statement of denial of human rights to minorities in the case of citizens of Negro descent in the United States of America, and an appeal to the United Nations for redress. The 96-page report was edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, and therein it demanded the US be held accountable, detailing the myriad horrors visited upon African Americans, from chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and lynchings. The report underscored the racist foundations of the shining city upon a hill, indeed the constitutional exclusions, and warned against the establishment of the UN headquarters in the country by intertwining domestic and international obligations. And I quote, because of caste customs and legislation along the colour line, the United States is today in danger of encroaching upon the rights and privileges of its fellow nations. Most people of the world are more or less coloured in skin. Their presence at the meetings of the United Nations as participants and as visitors renders them always liable to insult and to discrimination because they may be mistaken for Americans of Negro descent, end quote. And due to the ambiguity surrounding implementation measures or obligations, the issue of individual petition was a sore spot across both sides of the Cold War divide, or the very burgeoning, nascent Cold War. But thousands of letters had reached the UN Secretariat by 1947, pleading for support against tyranny and injustice. But these were resigned to what the Canadian head of the UN Secretariat's Human Rights Division referred to as probably the most elaborate waste paper basket ever invented. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was not only led the US delegation to the UN, but she was chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights, as well as a member on the board of directors to the NAACP, who had filed the report. But she was also one of the most high-profile opponents to considerations of the appeal to the world, and she referred to the threat posed to the US reputation and the potential ceding of moral high ground to the Soviets, and even threatened to resign if the US delegation were to introduce the report to the floor of the General Assembly, essentially leaving it to the Soviets to do so. And this is sort of highlights the culpability of liberal forces and figures in the upholding of white supremacist status quo. And this can be seen today in symbolic gestures of kneeling and hashtags of Black Lives Matter. They sort of fall short of action. Each time anti-Black brutality at the hands of the state lays bare the hollow center of American exceptionalism, where systemic racism flashes into mainstream discussion as a struggle over the soul of the US, the question is posed of the discrepancy of an external human rights advocate, yet an internal abuser. As UC Irvine law scholar and former UN Special Rapporteur David Kay noted, the US has long had its foreign policy foot inside the human rights system and the domestic one firmly outside, pointing to the legacy of racism and white supremacy in the protections afforded of American citizenship. But I want to dedicate the rest of this talk to thinking about how can we further deepen the investigation of this foreign embrace, yet domestic disavowal. So while the US shores its own borders of autonomy to thwart external involvement, how is it that Du Bois's colour line is drawn and redrawn to separate the free from the unfree, the haves from the have-nots, the human from the other? At the first Pan-African conference in 1900, at the turn of the century, Du Bois opened an address with one of his most quoted lines: "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the colour line." Going on to say, "The question as to how far differences of race will hereafter be made the basis of denying to over half the world the right of sharing the utmost ability to opportunities and privileges of modern civilization." So in 1900, the racial hierarchies were slightly more overt in the institutions of global order. But this history constitutes part of the imperial genealogies of the figure of the rogue state, the failure, the outlaw, the fragile state, all iterations of post-colonial states that have been rendered as governable entities. And the racialization of these spaces has been sanitized through the measurements of unfreedom, underdevelopment, and insecurity. But in our 2003 text, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, and Freedom, Sylvia Wynter, the Jamaican cultural theorist and professor emerita, just up the road actually from here at Stanford University, sought to disentangle the human from what she termed the overrepresentation of man, described as the present ethnoclass of a Western bourgeois representation of the universal human. Referring to Frantz Fanon's category of the damned, Wynter has theorized the archipelago of human otherness. This compiles the poor, the criminalized, the jobless, the homeless, the imprisoned within the US, as well as the undeveloped spaces of the third and fourth world. And I quote, all of whom interned in their systematically produced poverty and expendability, end quote. So challenging this overrepresentation is defined as the struggle of our times. But Wynter notes an initial phase of the struggle in the 50s and 60s that flourished in multiple protest movements in the US and international anti-colonial movements. But from this brief hiatus, the radical and emancipatory movements were co-opted and re-territorialized. So in this, struggle against the overrepresentation, the domestic and international are not quite so distinct. They're much more porous and spaces of solidarity, grenzenlos, as the tagline of these international weeks. But I think this also sort of points to the vantage point of the regime of truth in terms of how alternatives can be incorporated into this, functioning discourse of power, how the more challenging aspects to the status quo can be stripped, but nevertheless incorporated. And the regime of truth structures what's included as a human rights issue, what struggles are indeed part of human rights history, and how the human is known. So following the Universal Declaration from 1948, which included civil and political, social and economic, as well as collective rights, from the 1950s on, there was a relative dearth of interest in human rights as a matter of foreign policy in the US. And indeed, white supremacy played a large role as segregationist Southerners perceived a potential threat to this system if there were to be any international oversight. And it was the civil rights movements across the 50s and 60s that contributed to forcing the end of this system. Internationally, in the interim, the period of formal decolonization and the expanding membership of the UN also saw the institutionalization of the right of self-determination, as well as collective rights, such as autonomy over resources and the right to development within human rights, and also intellectual attempts to decolonize the category of the human. You were thinking of Césaire and of course Frantz Fanon. The premier right of both the international covenants that were adopted by the General Assembly in 1966, whereas indeed the right to self-determination. And I quote, "All people have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development." End quote. To note, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights was eventually ratified by the US in 1992. This is from 1966. And the latter covenant, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, also from 1966, has not been ratified to this day. But in the context of the Cold War ideological struggle, as well as the coalitions across the movement of third worldism and the non-alignment movement, the human at the center of rights and the protections that would be afforded to such humanities to safeguard the dignity were a site of debate. They were, you know, a field of contestation and far from this neutral framework. The 1970s have been lauded in the relatively nascent field of human rights history as a decade of breakthrough, a revolution, the realization of the last utopia of a more limited roster of negative civil and political rights of the individual. And I want to situate this within the co-option and reterritorialization of the Western man, where the language of human rights and development have been rendered as neutral, as moral, but are indeed, this retrenchment of a sort of neo-colonial racial hierarchy. It's not only white supremacy that leads to racist policies at home, but these are embedded within sort of wider human rights movement and what Joseph Slaughter has referred to as a rollback in, you know, more emancipatory fixtures of sort of third worldist human rights, or the multiple shifting third worldism human rights. Slaughter has argued that, and I quote, "We also need to better apprehend how the supranationalization of individual rights became a powerful neo-imperial instrument for deforming the right to self-determination and undermining third world sovereignty." End quote. The 1970s is a decade of crises. There was the oil crisis, the fall of Bretton Woods, and there was a crisis of US identity in the wake of the disastrous Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. And it was a congressional push which forced human rights back into US foreign policy, as well as you know, the success of human rights NGOs and the variety of other rights movements domestically within the US, which all fed into how these were addressed within Congress. But the bureaucratic shift was focused upon military and economic foreign assistance, the introducing of aid conditionality on the basis of, you know, a human rights assessment. So from the 1970s, I argue that human rights were retrenched as a sort of American virtue, an American responsibility, and increasingly rights were applied as a measure of post-colonial sovereignty and for those found wanting. A subcommittee of the House produced a report, Human Rights in the World Community, a call for US leadership. And this didn't so much explore the meaning of human rights, but rather explored the interests and responsibilities of the US. And in the 1974 Foreign Assistance Act, this included a section noting that the president should reduce or terminate assistance to governments that were engaged in a consistent pattern of internationally recognized human rights, but then defining these as torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges, or other flagrant denials of the right to life, liberty, and the security of person. And indeed, this internationally recognized human rights did leave a rather broad field, particularly at that moment. And this pared back articulation of rights was discussed in a paper prepared in 1975 for the Advisory Council of USAID, the Agency for International Development. It opens with the assertion that while human rights can have many meanings, quote, we do not need to await the perfect definition or embark on a comprehensive examination of the philosophical and moral concepts underlying the term. Rather, it suggested the department could function with a working definition as above. So recognizing that very few of those rights appear to have a direct connection with their stated goal of development, with the protection of urban or rural poor, the report rationalizes such a focus as necessary for the realization of actual, not theoretical, achievement of safeguards and access to rights and protections. And this notion of the feasibility of civil and political rights over the sort of socioeconomic counterparts as well as collective has become a dominant theme in US rights discourse and in international rights more generally. But yes, in the same year of 1975, Daniel Moynihan was appointed as US ambassador after publishing a critique of the Third World calls for a new international order in the neoconservative magazine Commentary. He laments the declining influence of the West in general and the US in particular, and he placed human rights at the center of this rejuvenation of American strength, so that, you know, the power projection of the US could be grounded within a sort of uptake of human rights. And writing in 1977, commenting on Carter's presidential run, he argued that, and I quote, human rights is the single greatest weapon we have left for the defense of liberty, end quote. And this was very much, you know, against not only, you know, the Soviet Union, the tyranny of the Soviets, but also the Third World and the Third Worldism movements for the new international economic order, and what he saw as, you know, these other articulations of freedom that were dangerous and could lead to international disorder. And in the Carter administration, human rights were institutionalized within the State Department. The establishment for the Bureau of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. The Bureau was tasked with preparing country reports on human rights in compliance with the Foreign Assistance Acts. And this was initially limited to the countries that were receiving assistance, but later expanded to include all countries, bar one, as the US have not been subject to a self-evaluation. But yeah, analysing the Carter administration's embrace of human rights in the 1970s, historian John Kane argued that the beauty of human rights was that they seemed simply moral, unideological, almost apolitical, where American virtue could be wrenched from claims of American imperialism. But, you know, this simplicity is complicated, and I urge us to, you know, think about human rights and how these function as incredibly ideological, as very political, as markers of civilization, of autonomy and self-sufficiency, and as marking trustworthiness in the international, but also, you know, the other potentials for human rights, you know, the way that we can think of human rights otherwise. But these are deeply political and certainly not simple. But writing in the moment of the sweeping self-determination and new nationalisms of the decolonization processes, Frantz Fanon critiqued the false dichotomy of self-reliance and dependency that pervaded and that continues to inform the struggle for legitimate statehood. Discussions on development revolve around the mettle of the formerly colonized to prove their worthiness and to achieve the status of the developed. As, and I quote, "There's a widespread belief that the European nations have reached their present stage of development as a result of their labors," end quote. Those undeveloped masses now must do the same. And it's in this refusal to recognize the interlinkages of exploitation and accumulation grounded in the racialized logics of capability that were foundational to the international power of the West. There's no articulation of the pillaging of the former colonial spaces and of the structural chronic lack of infrastructure. The plight of underdevelopment is demarcated by, and I quote, "the geography of hunger with their shrunken bellies, not only a world of poverty and inhumanity, but of a chronic lack of infrastructure." And I end quote. The derisory claims that a national independence would constitute a backward step is informed by a demand to replicate the successes of the West without this indifferent pillaging. And this is the sort of separation between, in taking socioeconomic rights away from and separating this from the political. This is further contributes to the ahistoricizing of the place of colonial sovereignties on the periphery, or indeed as a problem of international relations. So racialized thought is not, just reducible to ideas about race that are based on, biology or markers of skin color or indeed any other. But this sort of longer history of European expansion and imperialism has produced racialized social orders. And this requires that we consider expanded notions of racialized thoughts. But the 1970s also saw a crisis in development as the Keynesian models of modernization gave way to neoliberalism that was so heartily embraced by the Reagan and Thatcher premierships across the 1980s. And underdevelopment was increasingly seen as a marker of potential international instability, as a point of insecurity. And debates in the UN on the root causes of refugee flows, circulations that were fundamentally seen as circulations from the global south to the north, that are now echoed in contemporary debates on migration in Europe, Australia, and the US, very much situated the problem of underdevelopment within the underdeveloped states in those debates that were dominated by the Western powers. This is the sort of, the containment of the underdevelopment interned in their, incapacity. And addressing the 1981 North-South Conference in Cancun, Reagan delivered what's become known as the magic of the market speech, introducing a neoliberal solution to development, an economics that was based upon trade liberalization, deregulation, privatization, and a rejection of state-based capitalism and statist development. Across the 1980s, neoliberalism became the language not only of international finance institutions such as the IMF, but it pervaded the discourse of elites in the global south, shifting from an internationalist perspective toward nation-state capability, as aid conditionality was increasingly tied not only to economic reform, but the judgment of democratic political progress. And the dominance of this belief in the retributive power of the unregulated market by the end of the 80s is witnessed in the Washington Consensus. This is a contested term in itself, but it denotes a consensus across Washington-based institutions, including USAID, the World Bank, and the IMF. And the underlying prescription was that the state should relinquish power, except from the reinforcement of law and order, to the rational forces of the market, on the belief that the political and social problems will be resolved through this marriage of economic liberty and the rule of law. So the assumption that globalization of this, sort of formula for success is the pathway to peace and security. So the contemporary discourse wherein development, human rights and security are sort of mutually constitutive has subsumed socioeconomic rights and alternatives as developmental needs and into a sort of teleological narrative of good governance. So I want to wrap up the talk by referring to the production in US foreign policy of categories of post-colonial states that are defined by a sort of lack, that are problematized, at least in part, through reference to universal human rights norms. And that in this problematization, they are rendered as governable entities. So investigating the liberal governmentalities of security, Marcus Keenscherf has highlighted the exclusions that are not, quote, directed at all and sundry, but in fact, liberal authoritarianism in general and liberal violence in particular tends to be aimed at individuals, populations, and spaces that are seen as either recalcitrant to liberal rule or as threats to the liberal capitalist order. The fatal arrest of George Floyd was due to an alleged use of a counterfeit $20 bill. One of the arresting officers admitted they had neither inspected nor collected the note, as a former officer, Thomas Lane, noted in an interview with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, quote, "We were more concerned with at least attaining the person on suspicion of passing a counterfeit bill and then figuring out the validity of the bill," end quote. So this presumption of guilt relies upon racist assumptions of criminality and also sort of exposes a threat perception wherein securing against the potential subversion of capital is above the preservation of Black life. Yeah, and I want to sort of, extrapolate some of these relations onto the international level and think of it more in terms of, how these sort of lines and boundaries of freedom and unfreedom don't fit across the neat boundaries of the domestic, rule of law and the international, rule by international law, or indeed the state of nature, depending on who you subscribe to, or neither. So the rogue state was initially conceived purely in terms of the threat of their foreign relations, and this was namely focused upon support for hijackings and terrorism. However, as the outlaw in the Reagan administration and the backlash and finally the rogue under Clinton, the issue of human rights were tied to a propensity to act irrationally on the world stage. If a state could not be trusted with their own people, then how could they be included in the mutuality of international law? And the first use of the term failed state in 1992 was by two State Department officials in an article tellingly entitled "Saving Failed States." And this depicts a sort of new and dire threat to the international and the sort of like immediate post-Cold War world of the failure. They cite massive human rights abuses as one of the signifiers, which threaten the citizens as well as the international community through spillover effects such as refugee flows and conflicts. But for both these articulations, we can see the complete, taking these out of the longer histories of colonial sovereign contingency, of the markers of sovereign autonomy. And as Bilgin and Morton have noted, the question of who has failed the failed state is almost never asked. As think tanks such as Freedom House and the Failed State Index, and now the Fragile State Index, produce indices that rank the freedom and capability of states. And these are then used to calculate threat as early indicators and also to they're also used by foreign policy professionals to calculate the responses to these supposed threats. So a focus purely on internal regimes pathologizes and depoliticizes these spaces as doomed to failure due to their own shortcomings in governance, and completely discounts colonial context and the related stance upon the global periphery. These are held against markers of success, and the spaces are problematized through reference to a lack, a deficiency, without any recognition of constraints. So the initial interventions of the War on Terror against the failure of Afghanistan and the rogue of Iraq serve to illuminate this sort of juxtaposition between the civilized world and the barbaric other, as negative civil and political human rights norms were immediately deployed in the delegitimizing of these spaces as hotbeds for terrorism, and the sort of gendered and racialized depictions of the victim and of the savage, of the violator, were sort of distinguished from the human rights savior, who was instituting a regime change as freedom through the fostering of, the successful state of a democratic and neoliberal polity. And the Bush doctrine of anticipatory self-defense was hinged upon this re-articulation of the legal principle of imminence in the face of a fundamentally, supposedly novel international, where the unfree in their very existence were understood to pose a potential possible future threat. So to reproduce this claim to novelty with the War on Terror as a legal exception only serves to reproduce the ahistorical reading of a post-colonial lack, a lack of freedom, a lack of security, and a lack of law. So finally, just want to note that lamentations of the, Brexit referendum in 2016 and, the election of Trump just a few months later, these often refer to the decline of the liberal international order. So this was established in the wake of the Second World War, institutionalizing the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and, calling upon the norms of universal human rights. But the developmental studies scholar Olivia Rutasiva has adeptly posed the question, what exactly are we being invited to mourn in these tracts? So this loss of liberal humanitarianism evokes a history of humane behavior, benevolence, but this sanitizes critical reflection on development and structures the questions that researchers can pose on, what is the expertise of humanitarianism, and what assumptions of the human are informing those expertise. So to challenge this dominant human rights regime of truth, as Winter states, to challenge the overrepresentation of man, we have to sort of think beyond these lines drawn between the free and the unfree. And Opal Tomety, the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, has stated that it's not a civil rights movement, but a human rights one. It calls for investment in solutions like quality education, restorative justice, mental and emotional health support, and job opportunities, and recognizes a transnational struggle for racial justice. So far this year, President Biden has only made one address on America's place in the world, and the overarching message of this, following Trump and placing Trump as this extreme aberration in US foreign policy, and rather saying that America is back, is the through line of the speech. And I quote, "We must start with diplomacy rooted in America's most cherished democratic values, defending freedom, championing opportunity, upholding universal rights, respecting the rule of law, and treating every person with dignity." But I just want to end on this note that perhaps, we need to think further than going back. A return is not simply moral, nor apolitical. And I urge us to, think beyond to decolonize the human of rights. And thank you very much. I guess we can open the floor to questions.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for this fascinating and complex analysis of the place of human rights in U.S. international security imaginaries. As I've said before, you can ask questions by either using the YouTube chat function, but you have to be signed in order to do this. You can also send an email to help@amerikahaus.de. You should see the email below. The first question has already come in, and the questions will then be relayed to me. But the first question is already on my screen. So the question is, thank you very much for this interesting talk, first of all. And the actual question, why are human rights such a fluid concept that is, as you pointed out, applied to each person differently?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, why there's such a fluid concept? I suppose that's not necessarily such a bad thing, I suppose. However, I guess the complexity of what can be covered within the human life, within structuring human dignity, sort of lend itself towards this fluidity. But also, of course, international law more generally can be a rather complex beast in terms of the enforcement and the structures around who can sort of define the different legalities and legal frameworks of human rights. But I also think with the fluidity therein is could potentially be a strength of human rights, because this, shoring up of a very small, or not very small, but a very narrow concept is based in, this sort of Anglo-American, sort of Western Eurocentric notion of the international. And there hasn't been a sort of, not on this international scale, a real, attempt to wrangle with what we mean by the human. And this is something that is going on in, coalitions, and indeed, just in national things too, but, in human rights treaties of, African coalitions, also in Pan-Asian, and even in things like Bandung. So the fluidity can offer many opportunities for collaboration and coordination, but of course it's the open-endedness of the concept can be a stick to beat this with.
Okay, thanks. The next question takes us into the present and even into the future. Is there any prediction possible how the Biden administration will handle race and rights beyond words?
That is a difficult, indeed a very difficult question to answer. And so far, we haven't necessarily gotten too much of a taste of what exactly the Biden administration is going to, fulfill in many of the areas of the new policy. I think what is interesting is the how quickly perceptions of aberration change, because when we're saying, oh, America is back or returning, of course the Bush administration was considered such a huge exceptionalism at the time, but now this has somehow moved toward being within the larger structures of liberal internationalism and indeed American foreign policy structures, and Trump being this exceptional aberration. And while of course Trump was in many ways an aberration, but in some foreign policy aspects didn't actually shift too radically from, particularly in terms of interventionism. It wasn't necessarily a super isolationist turn. So I think what is interesting is certainly that, yeah, Biden is in this recalling of this past. It's, yeah, amazing how in such a short amount of time we can completely have shifted our critical facets of or critical thought on what was such a huge shift in American foreign policy at that time, seemingly. At least, you know, that's what the premise in terms of this novelty of the war on terror. Yeah, we can only hope that there could be some, you know, I guess many voices who are contributing to the Biden administration. However, so far, doesn't look like it will be too radical a foreign policy change anyway, but who knows?
Okay. Follow-up question. Is there any administration that stands out? I mean, historically, the post-war years are that you would single out as being atypical, as not being part of this of your framework of analysis, or that doesn't fit, kind of?
Well, I guess because I sort of would say that the way that human rights entered into these larger, yeah, sort of racial ontologies or colonial ontologies is more from the 70s. And, you know, before Carter, I mean, it was introduced before Carter, but since the president has taken it up, not that it's completely, this regime of truth doesn't mean that, you know, this is an unchanging framework of human rights, but rather that, yeah, this, you know, it is still historically contingent, and this shift in threatscape from Carter to Reagan to this post-Cold War to the war on terror, you know, there are changes there, but I think the malleability of human rights to fit within these you know, sort of moral structures of American foreign policy. I think from Carter, there hasn't really been a president who hasn't fit. I mean, perhaps, I mean, Trump did, of course, also talk about human rights, but in a rather different way. However, in the functioning of the administration, it still actually had the you know, the same structures in terms of the human rights reporting, and Pompeo and the State Department still sort of upholding these. But no, and I think that what is interesting is not that it's a continuity, but rather that the distinctions between, say, the humanitarian interventionism of the 90s and the war on terror are not such this huge gap that is not that human rights were not necessarily there in, you know, the entire threatscape of the war on terror, but rather this was a sort of integral part to how terrorism was conceived and how it was sort of, yeah, territorialized within particular states as well. Not that human rights is the only, but that it is a very important factor. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain why far-right extremism and the contempt for human rights is on the rise, not only in the US, but around the world?
That is difficult. Contempt for human rights from the far right. Well, presumably, I mean, I guess there are many varied and different figures within, or mentalities within the far right. But of course, one aspect of the far right is that certainly, you know, any type of international governance or enforcement strategy would certainly not be welcome. Also, I imagine that it fits within this constellation in that, you know, human rights is this inherently liberal, as in, you know, as opposed to, I don't know if they see themselves as fascist, but presumably not. But or presumably, I don't know. But yeah, as this sort of, you know, like over, like not a nanny state, but this sort of like over empowerment of the state, that giving too much, you know, that because, you know, one underlying thing is this, you know, sort of like freedom of choice, and that you make your own way, and that you are able to prosper and succeed on your own. So I suppose also that there would be these, you know, sort of like handouts or whatever would be within that.
Okay. One aspect that, I mean, the two of us talked about before in various circumstances, but that is still puzzling me is the question: how do you navigate between actual breaches of human rights that might require some kind of intervention and unjustified US humanitarian or other interventions? Do you have to draw a line to kind of draw a boundary and decide which one is which?
I don't know that one needs to, the fact that these structures of power exist doesn't necessarily negate the fact that there would be, you know, that there are abuses, and that these protections can be there too. But nevertheless, even within, you know, the structures of power that have been constructed to also provide protections, these do function within a way that, you know, is more of a sort of one-way system, and that does, you know, nonetheless often reproduce systems of power that in the long run, you know, doesn't necessarily equal a more equal sovereignty. These are sort of fundamentally premised upon these, you know, falsehoods of, yeah, equal sovereignty, of yeah, like a neutrality before the law. And it also covers, you know, how human rights enforcement can be, sought. You know, I wouldn't, you know, one wouldn't argue that Saddam Hussein was a, you know, dictator and obviously like very abusive towards his own citizens. However, the sanctions across the 1990s, you know, before the intervention, the war on terror, they arguably, you know, were huge. It had a huge loss of life and sort of contributed to, you know, a huge, well, these affected the people more than they would affected the power. So, and the lives of Iraqi citizens were sort of expendable in this larger, from both sides, like from the sanctions that were being, and from the dictatorial leader who wouldn't acquiesce, so to say. So I think also, even when things are justified, also this does shape like who is, you know, which life is able to be sacrificed within these powers of saving life, and also in terms of, you know, bombing for the, you know, the advancement of freedom, or for the protection of human rights. Yeah, so I think in terms of the enforcement measures, that is also something that are colored by these racial hierarchies, and even, you know, and the fostering of human rights abuses and of you know, sort of ethnic tensions, or yeah, sort of migratory movements that the US as well as the wider, you know, Western system problematizes from post-colonial spaces. These are often from, well, these can also be the problematization doesn't often sort of consider how histories as well as ongoing processes of coloniality also contribute to these systems, which in themselves is a problem. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What motivated you to take on the subject? Another question.
Yeah, well, I was, very interested in basically how, how one legislates, I suppose, for the human, or how the philosophy of man can, be practiced across policy that interests me. And as I sort of mentioned earlier in my my postgrad rather, I kept coming up against the concept of human rights, but never that it wasn't the object of my study or anything. But it sort of rang a little bell every time that I saw it. And as I say, often these are not qualified, certainly not problematized. But something that is just so easy to invoke, human rights is something that, is sort of immediately peppering some sort of moral superiority, or certainly, invoking a particular notion to an idea. But it was something that was never qualified or explained in things that I was researching for post-Cold War foreign policy. And then when I began, doing it in terms of human security, even, what I found interesting is that, as I said, actually the history of human rights itself, like human rights has obviously been studied for a long time, but you often from the perspective of political science or legal scholars, so international law or so. But actually history's intervention is relatively new. And I was interested in putting human rights and security together, because I saw, this sort of within this, international order, the national security state, also founded around the same time as universal human rights declaration was founded, then also how the US can sort of place its own security within this global or humanity was interesting to me. And yeah, I think that was a perspective that hadn't been within the historiography of human rights yet. Hopefully soon. From me.
What do you think is the actual legacy of the civil rights movement of the 1960s when you think about the peculiar situation of African Americans in the US today?
So this is not necessarily my field, so bear with me if I say something, if I miss something out terribly. But yeah, the legacy of the civil rights movement. Well, I think it's also interesting that even, during the civil rights movement, of course, there was this huge strive towards more transnational notions of, the Black Atlantic, of transnational Black experience, of racial injustice with post-colonial spaces across the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, etc. And, Malcolm X even, he also was sort of situated the civil rights movement, well, not as civil rights, actually as human rights. And this was, there were many sort of Black intellectuals in the 50s and 60s who were sort of challenging racial injustice within this. How do we think about the human within American society, but also beyond, and how these two structures actually somehow inform each other. But yeah, the legacy of civil rights, well, I suppose there are many and varied. Here, in San Francisco, of course, like Oakland is just across the road, and I guess it's also the legacy of civil rights movement. It sort of depends upon who is telling the story of that legacy, and who is sort of problematized. And even the Black Panther movement, of course, can be remembered as this dangerous terrorist movement, or like in terms of the wider social justice community building efforts that also went on there, and also with COINTELPRO. So I guess the legacy of civil rights is also in terms of the US security state, of domestic threats, and of the sort of proliferation of a sort of who is able to be, who is found to be threatening to the status quo. But of course, there are many positive aspects.
Thanks. I mean, I don't see any more questions from the chat or from you, but I have one maybe final question myself, if I may, that leads to your or is directed at your current project. You're now working on the intersection of natural hazards, displacement, and migration. And it seems like something entirely different, but it's not, totally separated from your previous work, I think, in a way, because we also talk about racialized bodies and the containment of people and all these kinds of things. So what's the connection between your previous and your current project?
Yes, I think there are many points of connection, perhaps, in terms of the racialization of bodies, of who is able to move, also in terms of what is considered, what movement is considered threatening and when. Also, something I haven't at all explored as of yet, but I would like to, in the future, with this project as well, think more in terms of the wider application of collective rights within, sort of climate mobilities, and also collective rights over resources, but also, the stewarding of the environment in terms of that as a rights framework also. So not necessarily something I've touched upon yet, but I think there are many fields of intersection there, and ways that one can, or that there is much work going on already, and that I would like to contribute to, in terms of pushing forward a productive rearticulation of rights, or sort of decolonizing human rights in general. But I think there, and also so many like indigenous scholars as well in the US, but also in with natural hazards, the states that I'm looking at, and indeed the colonial holdings such as Puerto Rico that I'm looking at, these self-determination rights over how to respond. But of course this also fits in with the sort of domestic / international more entanglements, because one can't uphold these we continue to uphold the stark distinctions between domestic and international, but of course these are becoming ever more permeable with these relations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for giving this lecture, for joining us tonight. This was highly informative, and of course, it's also highly important research that you are doing. And hopefully, the book will come out soon, so that all of us will have a chance to take an even deeper look at what you have been working on over the last couple of years. Yeah, it's a great manuscript so far, and will certainly be a great book, hopefully coming out soon. I would like to thank Sarah, of course, and also the audience, all of you out there who have joined us tonight. Thanks a lot for coming, for turning on your computer, and for logging in. I would like to thank the Bavarian American Academy for hosting this event. If you're interested in the activities of the BAA, just check the website, and also the website of the Amerika-Haus here in Munich. With this, I will end this session. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Sarah, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.